I heard someone once say, experience is something you get just after you need it. And so I'm quite experienced, meaning I've almost, I've lost 6 of my 9 lives. So much of the book is about mistakes I've made in the mountains that led to new protocols in the mountains. And so that's really what got me over the hump, was just the feeling that I could add value to the backcountry community.
Welcome to Season 13, Episode 1 of the Backcountry Podcast. I'm Adam Howard. From a distance, the career of Jeremy Jones looks impossible. He is, after all, a pro snowboarder, entrepreneur, activist, filmmaker, and author. How does he sleep? I mean, never mind that he's also a husband, father, and active community member in Truckee, California. And somehow he still manages to ride about 200 days a year. The founder of Jones Snowboards has stayed true to his passions while owning and operating one of the most innovative brands in the sport. At any given time, you might find him in a skintrack in Tahoe, or in Washington, D.C., advocating for the planet on behalf of Protect Our Winners, an organization he founded in 2007. In this episode, Jeremy reflects on the impact of the life of the late Craig Kelly, whose untimely death while training to become a guide set the sport of backcountry snowboarding back a decade. Jeremy speaks of his own personal journey from being the first certified snowboarder at Mount Mansfield in Stowe, Vermont, to riding some of the raddest lines on the planet, to the pure joy he finds in powsurfing behind his house. We'd like to thank Arva for supporting this episode and independent media. For 35 years, Arva has been at the forefront of designing and developing snow safety equipment. But now their commitment to safety goes a step further with a campaign that touches the hearts of adventurers and their loved ones alike. Inspired by the relationship between Arva athlete and two-time freeride world tour champion Aurélien Decroix and his mother, Safer for You, Better for Mom reflects Arva's deep understanding of the dual nature of mountain passion, the irresistible draw for explorers, and the legitimate concern families have for the safety of their loved ones. Arva's message urges us to listen to our inner voice of caution, that little voice that guides us toward prudence. It's the voice of our loved ones, which even in the silence of snow-covered mountains reminds us of the importance of safety and sound decision-making. By choosing Arva, you honor the call of the mountains while weaving in an invisible yet resilient thread that connects you, the adventurer, to those who eagerly await your return. Safer for You, Better for Mom embodies this dual commitment, the promise of exploration and the peaceful return to your loved ones. Learn more at arva-equipment.com or check out #SaferForYou. All right, friends, let's get into it. We hope you enjoy this new episode. Jeremy Jones, welcome to the Backcountry Podcast.
Thank you. Honored to be here.
So this morning, as I was preparing for this, I watched Life of Glide. It's available on YouTube, and there were several things that stood out to me. One was just how beautiful snowboarding is in powder. And as a skier, just every time I watch it, especially guys like yourself, I wish I could do it. Second, you mentioned Craig Kelly, and of course, he had such an impression, not just on the snowboarding community, but just on mountain people in general. So I reached out to Eric Blem, who has a forthcoming book on Craig's life. And I wanted to just read a quick passage from that and kind of get your take on it. This comes from the prologue about Craig. He was a superhero born from a blizzard on a sleeping volcano. He levitated down mountains, raced avalanches, aired cliffs, and landed on the covers of magazines. If God walked the earth, says photographer Gordon Esham, Craig was one of them. That's not hyperbole. We all believed it, says fellow pro rider Jason Ford, right up to the moment we heard the impossible news of his death. One of the things that Craig talked about often was progression and progressing not just his riding, but the sport. And I find in your vernacular the same sentiment. Like, yeah, you're doing this for yourself in some ways, but a lot of what you're doing on the backcountry side and probably throughout your career has been to push the sport. You don't hear skiers talking like that as much. What is it about snowboarding that kind of has that ethos built into it?
Yeah, I can't necessarily speak exactly to that, but I do, just going back to Craig and this book that I've had a chance to read, which anyone out there, Eric Blem's a phenomenal artist and an incredible snowboarder that's come back to the sport to write this book. And it is just so exciting to read that good of writing on such an incredible person, Craig. And the thing that is interesting from a progression with Craig that I do think that I've followed is if you follow Craig's sport or his, snowboarding, he would move through different aspects of the sport and almost so he could keep progressing. And there's obviously, you see it in the half pipe that he was doing. He did it with the world titles, but then he realized then he went to the backcountry, and then he went to splitboarding, and then he was on this kick of, I want to become a guide so I can give people the best day of their life and give them this gift of snowboarding. And so as you get into especially this foot-powered backcountry snowboarding, there is no mastery there. And I think that's probably one of the reasons Craig loved it, is the learnings are infinite. And so I just think Craig's ability to continue to evolve as a person through snowboarding really is something that resonates with me the most.
His version of progression and sharing, I mean, he wanted to do it in person with people. And I've certainly seen that a lot with, we'll call them older pros, that they have so much knowledge, they've learned so much, and they just want to kind of keep it going and share that knowledge. And I even find that in myself. I love coaching little kids. Maybe that's the parent in me, but you share it in a different way. I mean, you've had the good fortune of just having this access to all this filming opportunity that continues. Is that your version of this? I mean, it is quite different, but
there was the 50 plus movies I made that was like, turn up the heavy metal and we're going to get 4 minutes of high action snowboarding and just get people fired up to send on their snowboard. And then, once I went to this foot powered snowboarding with deeper, further, and higher, that became more about meeting the mountains on their terms and the lessons that we can all learn. You see me learning them, and hopefully the viewer then in turn is inspired to learn those. To Life of Glide, which is my personal favorite. And I remember I was watching Higher in my hometown. We premiered it there, and I was like, the next movie I'm making Under the Chairlift and on the Side of the Road, which is Life of Glide, which is super simple snowboarding. It's the art of the turn. It's how much joy we get from simple snowboarding. And then the film after that was this Ode to Muir, which is all about backyard exploration in what I would call pretty subpar conditions, which we love for backcountry snowboarding, which is settled, stable POW. But to make an hour-long film in terrain like that, and again, seeing the learnings from the mountains and on from there, now I'm at a point where if I am making a film, there needs to be some deeper meaning to it that the viewer is going to take something out of it and make ideally it helps their snowboarding experience get better. And that doesn't mean you got to get crazy deep with it. Because again, Life of Glide is just like, look at the joy of making a turn on a snowboard under the lift. But there's always these undertones of, can we make it so that viewer, when they sit down and watch that film and walk out of that theater, that they got new thoughts in their head, they're inspired, they want to continue to evolve.
One of the things that stuck with me from Life of Glide was the powsurfing bit and the shaping and all that stuff, which, there is another connection with Craig, right? He kind of had an engineer's brain and was interested in gear, but the shaping, and we could talk forever about tech, even though shaping just seems so organic. It's almost like science than tech. But talk to me a little bit about that experience with and I forget the guy's name, who's the surfboard shaper. What was that like?
Yeah, so that's Chris Christensen, who we go in and we actually shape a snowboard the same manner in which he shapes a surfboard. And, it was this incredible experience because the end result is we got on these really rudimentary wooden pow surfers, but they had a glide that was so pure and clean that I'd never felt on snow before. And we produced the pow surfer. Then we're like, man, I wonder if this would work at, should we make this for bindings? And it was a specific moment where it was because the board is so wide and the rocker is so nuanced that the mold for it was going to be about 5 times more than a traditional mold. And Jones had been around for, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 years. And I'm talking to Xavier Neidecker about like, man, that's kind of a big deal to spend 5x on this mold. And we talked about it. And I'm like, you know what? I started a snowboard company to bring new things to market. And we just started cutting corners in other ways. And I remember he said, how many of those do you think you can sell? I'm like, not many, but it will be incredible. And it ended up being this really successful board that launched the Jones Surf series, which has now got multiple shapes in it.
And these are all pow surfers.
These are actually, we still have the traditional pow surfer, but these are 4 boards that are traditional Christensen Jones snowboards. And then we also make a couple of them in split boards.
I reached out to a friend this morning, and I'm going to give him a shout out, Tahoe Campbell. He's an OG snowboarder from Southern Vermont, went to UVM, skied at Stowe. And his question was, bindings or no bindings? That's all he wanted to know.
Well, I mean, I love them both, but what I do, the beauty of the pow surfer is just, it really takes me back to, I started on a Burton backhill with the water ski bindings, wooden, and there is something really freeing about just going to a backyard hill, 200 feet long, and just the simplicity of not being strapped in and just walking to the top, throwing the board on the ground, hopping on it, and wiggling these small turns is really an incredible and the purest form of what I would call snowboarding.
And so accessible to so many people.
Yes, definitely.
You talk about the back hill. Let's throw it back a little bit to where it all started for you.
Yeah. So I know you're calling in from Vermont, which just has such a warm spot in my heart because Vermont really changed my life. And it really started with my parents falling in love with skiing and saying, get in the car, kids, we're going to the mountain. And we got a small condo at the base of Toll House at Stowe and would do the 5-hour drive every weekend. But I was really into skateboarding and I like skiing, but it was, I still remember going to the basement of Shaw's General Store and seeing a Burton backhill in the basement and going, that's what I want for Christmas. And from there, I would ski in the day and then I'd go and hike with a headlamp in the kind of hills behind my house. And they had a program where you could trade in the board every year. And it was at this time where the next year was a Burton Performer with high backs. And then it was a Burton Elite Performer with metal edges. And then it was a Burton Cruiser. At that time, it was allowed on the mountain. And just out of happenstance, the very first day it was allowed, I was at the mountain first thing and was like, you had to get certified back then. And I ended up becoming the first person to get certified on a snowboard. And, that really hooked ever since.
This was at Stowe.
This was at Stowe.
Really? You were the first snowboarder certified at Stowe.
Yeah. And it was it sounds like this crazy thing, but I think there was a total of 3 of us certified. My cousin and this guy, John Percy from Percy Farms. It was so rare to see other snowboarders beyond that. And it was an exciting time of the sport where by the end of the day, all the snowboarders would end up riding together because there were so few of us.
It's just amazing to think about where it's come.
Yeah. And it just one comment I want to make kind of before we get off of Craig, because Someone asked me, and I believe it was a journalist from Backcountry Mag, and I think it was like the 10-year passing of Craig. And he asked me about it, and he said, where do you think the sport would be if Craig didn't pass? And it was a really heavy thought because, we lost our North Star, and it really kind of took such an extreme turn to urban snowboarding and stuff. And not that I'm against any of that, but it really backcountry snowboarding went totally away, and there was virtually no progression in that side of the sport. So I remember I was at Rosignol for many years, and it was always like so reluctant to try new things. And, that side of the sport really hit a 10+ year pause with the passing of Craig.
I remember we were in our first year of operation in 2003 when Craig died in the Selkirks. And I remember coming out of that and thinking and hearing, as we had to report it all. And it was conveyed to me at the time that he was kind of doing this on the down low. My sense was that it was so new, and him becoming a splitboard guide, Rudy Beglinger was, guided on a splitboard, approach skis, etc. But he was primarily a ski guy. He would switch it up, much to his credit, frankly. He's under-celebrated for that. But it was like, can he do it? I think a lot of the guiding community and a lot of us were like, is it possible? Is this even possible? And do you remember it like that? Was it kind of on a down low? And take us through that. What do you recall of that time in his life?
His whole thing was like, look, I've taken enough photos of me snowboarding. I'm on this different path, and it has nothing to do with being a pro snowboarder. And he was so driven to be a guide. And at that time, the fact that he committed to the Canadian AVI certification, there was so much resistance to like, who's this guy? These backcountry accreditors didn't know Craig. Sure, he's a pro snowboarder, but they did not know that they were dealing with one of the most elite mentally and athletic people. And he had to claw his way in to get that level of respect. And he was just so fit and such a engineer. He was the perfect guy to kind of soften those edges for snowboarders.
Your point about how it set the sport back as we know it today. I've thought, as a skier, I've thought about that, but it's really kind of unfair for me, given, like just my lack of knowledge that someone like yourself would have, whether or not that was really true. But then I get back to that down low thing. Like if it had been very public what he was doing and attempting, and more people knew about it, more riders knew about it, that maybe that mantle would have been picked up more quickly.
I mean, Dave Downing shot a video part on a split board. So it wasn't that he was purposely on the down low. It was just the sport at that point was just in such a different phase. I mean, at that point, I remember just to set an example of that was I spent a month in Alaska with Johan Olofsson. It's the best snowboarding I've ever seen a snowboarder do on that trip. And the photographer sent the photos to Trans World Snowboarding, and it was that back then it was in slides, and so he FedExed them in this sealed deal, and the photographers they sent back the photos without even opening the the FedEx envelope. So it was just the sport could care less about backcountry snowboarding at that point.
And the industry itself, like the manufacturers, were a big part of that holdup. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't that it was necessarily the birth of snowboard parks, but it was the explosion of snowboard parks and freestyle contests and big air contests when there was huge money in them, and they were doing the global stadium tours and things of that nature, that side of the sport was just exploding. And so that was their focus.
So one of the things in Eric's book, the title of which is The Darkest White, that Craig references. I have a PDF of this, so I could do a search, and when I search couloir or backcountry, it pops up all over the place. And couloir, which was frankly way more progressive than we were at the time, certainly on the snowboarding side, because Craig Dostie, the publisher of couloir, was a snowboarder. Craig loved that. And so that was the outlet for a lot of early backcountry snowboarders were the little guys like us and Couloir. But yeah, the industry itself was definitely behind, but you can understand it from a business perspective. Let's talk about how, like, when you first got into it. I mean, you've been at it long enough that you used to cut your own boards. What was that like?
When Craig passed, what little flame was burning on split boards was, got snuffed out. And then I look at it as there was this smoldering fire that, sat there dormant for 10 years. And then I have to give credit to Will Ritter from Spark R&D. He came out with the Spark binding, which helped the split board. But even before the Spark, like my first year shooting deeper, it was on a DIY split. And I think halfway through, I got an early prototype of the Spark. So it was kind of this collective effort. And the Karakoram guys came not far behind that, that was bubbling up, and a bunch of people fanned that flame. And, but it was funny when I did my first foot-powered film, Deeper, I figured I was 30 years old. I figured it would be the kind of my last film. I figured my career at 30 as a pro snowboarder is, quite old. I was totally happy with the career that I had. And I just got obsessed with foot-powered snowboarding, decided to make a film of it. I figured it would be my last film. I thought there would be a small group of really core people that would be excited about it, and that would be it. And I remember being at my hometown in Truckee we did the premiere at an outdoor amphitheater, and I was there, and I'm like, man, I just hope 200 people come to this thing, or it's going to be really awkward. And as things are starting to spool up, people are starting to come in. He's like, my friend's like, dude, the traffic is backed up, like all the way to Tahoe City, and 1,700 people came that night. And I clearly struck a chord with this kind of, people were ready for something new, I think.
Absolutely. So what year was Deeper?
2009.
And then there was like an industry response, and we overproduced. There were too many split boards on the market, right? And then it kind of died back again. We had a magazine out here called Chronicle, which was backcountry snowboarding, that Mike Horn was the editor of, and it was great. But it was like the fat biking craze. All of a sudden there were just so many fat bikes sitting on the bike shop floors. But now it seems like and you're now in the business with Jones. Why don't we start there? Take us back to like that foundation and how you decided to get into that.
Yeah. So I was kind of the first year through shooting Deeper. And the problem is when you split boards, they get soft. And it was funny because the two things I never wanted to do was kind of direct produce my own snowboard film or start a snowboard company. And in the course of about 4 months, I decided to do both of those things because I just wasn't getting the product that I needed at that point. Skiing, actually, there was this shape revolution going on. I was super close with Shane McConkey at that time, and we were talking a lot about rocker and everything. And because the sport was so freestyle focused, I actually had determined I was going to leave Rosignol. And so I was a couple options. There was a couple brands I was talking to about riding for them. And then there was kind of the fifth option, which was to start Jones. And I had some decent opportunities, but every one of them I'd be like, yeah, I'm super excited. I think there's so much room for shape evolution. At that point, nothing had happened, and real evolution in snowboarding had happened for 10 plus years. And they all said the same thing, like, we're psyched. We got a free ride line. We're not ready to put any money into it. And finally I was like, you know what? I need to start my own company if I'm going to get the product that I need. And so Jones launched the same year as Deeper did in 2009.
How much day to day? I wondered at the time, like, is he like grinding behind a desk all day, you know, getting this thing off the ground? Like, or did you have people, were you well capitalized? How did that all look? How did you get it off the ground?
I mean, a key thing was connecting with the Nidecker brothers, which at the time they were like, God, I want to say 15, 18, and 23. But they had kind of taken over their family business and it was really struggling. So to have their engineering abilities was massive. And then the fact that I didn't have any roadblocks to product development. So at Rosignol, we made some incredible product, but I would go and hang with this product designer and I would just try to finesse these changes over days on end, drinking wine with them and travel in the Alps. And so by the time I remember coming up with the 4-board line of Jones that we launched with, and I mean, it was instantly, I'd had those designs in my head. And so we were off to the races immediately. And I really struggled with calling it Jones. So that, I wasted some time on lists of, these huge lists of other names. And finally I was like, you know what? I got to put my name on this thing to just show this is me, this is my stuff. And I totally stand behind it. And so, yeah, the whole thing happened really fast. And it happened I went into it with really low expectations. I had seen so many brands come with this, like, we're going to come out with this huge team and big marketing budget, and we're going to just, explode and spend all our money to just grow, grow, grow. And I went into it and said, you know what? This is super niche. Maybe we'll sell 1,000 boards. I'm going to run the company in the black on 1,000 boards. Like I just decided, right, our marketing budget is a percentage of sales. And it was just really cut and dry on, because I figured it would be this long, slow, small company that, I can make a little bit of money, but I definitely wasn't like, I'm going to mortgage my house because this thing's going to go off. It was really just this slow kind of crawl and just focused on the fundamentals and making good product.
How much are you in the day-to-day operations of that today? I mean, and I ask this because you do so much other stuff. I don't know how you sleep, frankly.
Well, I didn't start a snowboard company not to snowboard. And I'm surrounded by incredible people that from the get-go, they're like, the most important thing you can do is be in the mountains. I mean, I've also never had a great idea for a product just sitting in front of my computer 8 hours every day. So I'm really good at delegating, and I'm in the mountains with a notebook in my pocket, constantly writing stuff down. And yeah, so it's a pretty natural thing that, it's just kind of been a part of my life. And I sleep great for, just so you know, and I'm definitely getting my turns in.
The Art of Schralpinism. This is the book you released a year ago, almost, maybe 13 months ago. And it's great for so many reasons. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but it's got some of your artwork in there. The thing as a writer, beyond your approach, which is super approachable, but also like it's super approachable for the newbie, but also the veterans too. Like I picked it up and like there's all these great little nuggets in there. And one of the ways you get those in there is because you keep journals. You write a lot of notes, which is, as a writer myself, like in my breast pocket, I have a pen and a little pad of paper always. And I get picked on about it, but it is what it is. When did you start journaling, and what was the impetus behind that? Was it from a teenage years? When did you get it going?
Yeah, I would say teenage years, and it would come and go. But if I was, on a snowboard trip or a surf trip, or definitely backpacking, I, always enjoyed the process of writing. It's so funny to date myself because I was just looking at some old letters. I mean, it's how my brothers and I used to communicate was through letters, and my brothers are incredible writers, and there's just so much vibrance in those letters. And I think my dad always instilled in my brothers and I that, look, art is not about the outcome. It's about the process. It's about getting on the other side of your brain and let it take you for a ride. Writing's the same way. But it was really when I went on these foot-powered trips, I was just so far out of my comfort zone and having these such intimate relationships with the mountains, really deep internal conversations about fear. I was losing friends in the mountains, and it was really through writing that I worked through so much of that stuff, and I certainly never planned on doing a book, but then it hit me as I spent more time in, say, traditional avalanche training and classes and stuff that are awesome, but I was like, you know what, I could write a book that would be such a good complement to your traditional Avi 1, Avi 2 courses. And it's really the backbone of it is, as I heard someone once say, experience is something you get just after you need it. And so I'm quite experienced, meaning I've almost, I've lost 6 of my 9 lives. So much of the book is about mistakes I've made in the mountains that led to new protocols in the mountains. And so that's really what got me over the hump, was just the feeling that I could add value to the backcountry community.
When you started to transition from, competition to heli and then over to backcountry, I got to think that, I was just on a trip, and the thoughts I have in the skin track are unlike thoughts that I have anywhere else, especially if I'm not breaking trail, because you're just following along. It's not like you're even walking on a hiking path where you really got to watch where the rocks are, and, you're stepping in a hole here and there. Obviously, there's so much abject stuff you've got to be cognizant of, but man, I find myself going deep, sometimes in a weird way, like, frankly. But did you find like that stuff was creeping into your journals, or you were more inclined to get that stuff down than you would be in this high intensity type, riding you were doing before, like just having that space?
Yeah, absolutely, man. And I couldn't agree more as far as like the walking meditation of a skin track. I don't know, the way I climb mountains is pretty damn slow. So it's not like I have this huge cardio output. I love being alone on the skin track. Sure, there's time for conversation, but the reality is we're covering so much ground that you have so much quiet time. But yeah, the foot powered stuff, I mean, I'm still snowboarding because it was almost like all this snowboarding that I did up until I was 30 was just a primer for the real stuff, which is this meeting these mountains on their own terms, and the intimacy of both that you need with the mountains and your personal conversations and stuff. I mean, the depth is so huge. So it's inevitably, easy to fill journals from days in the mountains where we're, getting up in the middle of the night and climbing out of our tent and walking into these dark mountains and listen to Serac Falls or what have you. I mean, it's like these real conversations with your fear. And is it boogeyman fear? Is it real fear? Am I, just so much of that. And because of that, it's, you talked about snowboarding. Last winter, I had a close to a 10-month winter and rode, almost 200 days last year. So I wouldn't be doing that if I didn't find my split board. And not just, the irony is the split board has made me fall back in love with the resort as well. Cause you go split board for a couple of weeks. I mean, there is no greater feeling than hopping on a chairlift with no backpack and a well-tuned snowboard, regardless of the condition. So, I'm as hooked as I've ever been on snowboarding right now.
That's so great to hear you say. As a veteran myself, like, I don't know that I've ever loved skiing more than I do now, um, for so many reasons.
I talking about with kids, that was this whole new phase for me where obviously we've shaped our life around being in the mountains, sliding on snow. But now I'm on this whole new chapter, which is experiencing it with kids. And then you see the power of the mountains that they have on kids, and that, out there, it's no longer dad, son, dad, daughter relationship. Your partner's out there, or you get stuck on the slow double and it stops and you just got to, hunker down in the wind, or all that stuff. It's just to think about how much more depth it's brought to my kids and my relationships is incredible. And you see how the depth of the gift that these winter sports are.
And some of that depth and some of the reason it's so special is because it's finite, right? It's always had a limited window for most people. You're not skiing year round necessarily, but it's, as we all know, it's more finite than it's ever been, and getting more so every day. Let's talk about POW. It almost seems, as I think about it for a quick second, that you've been asked everything there is to be asked about POW. You're in Washington, you're doing all this stuff. The organization, it's almost amazing to me how much it's flourished from when because I remember when it started, and there were other such organizations at the time, small, that started really grassroots within the ski industry. And I always wondered if it was going to resonate outside of it. How has POW been so successful in resonating outside of the snow sports industry?
That's a great question. I mean, I think for us, we've kind of expanded to what we call the outdoor state, which is 50 million people in the country that their lives revolve around, or I should say a central part of their life is some outdoor activity, which inevitably requires clean air, clean water, and a healthy planet to go and participate in that activity. And so I think we've tried to, we're big on common ground. We're backed by science. Our intentions are pure. And we got one agenda to get to get us on the right path of CO2 reduction. Scientists have been really clear that the way we're going to get the large scale CO2 reduction is through policy. And so, just in simple forms, those are our motives. And I think that it resonates with a large group of people.
And a growing number of people. And also, the outdoor community, as big as it's become, is one thing. I come from a farming background here in Vermont, and rural America is feeling this. Frankly, urban America is now too. What are some of the policies today that you're most excited about when you think about, okay, maybe we've got something here that can happen?
Well, another kind of saying we have is progress over perfection. So I think about it climbing a mountain. It's like, we know where the summit is. We don't know exactly how to get there, but we know we got to get out of base camp and start marching towards it and take these clear steps towards it that we know we need to take. But the Inflation Reduction Act that recently passed by the slimmest of margins, it's the biggest climate bill ever passed. It's not perfect, but it's already led to, massive jobs, a booming economy, which I would say those are the two things that have always kept optimism in this fight. Is the solutions, we have them and they create a ton of jobs. And so in the US alone, there's been $359 billion spent on this clean tech transition, employing hundreds of thousands of jobs. Moving forward, though, getting a more granular, we are trying to bring this bill to Congress right now, that was why I was just back there. And we understand the bottleneck right now is these transmission lines. And so ironically, we are now fighting for updating the grid and specifically the transmission line so we can get the energy to where it needs to be.
Have you been following some of the electric car stuff recently? I read the other day that, Ford, for instance, they're struggling, on their margins for their electric cars. The fear is they're going to have to keep pumping out these 6,000 pound SUVs to make it. Are we going to get to, and should we be thinking electric cars are our way forward, or are we in for a whole nother environmental crisis as a result of that transition?
Yeah, I mean, I get, it's clear electric cars need to, or the electrification, in simple terms, it's like, we want to electrify everything and then clean up the energy we use to power that grid. That process is the simplest process to getting the large scale CO2 reduction. Will there be hangups on that transition? Absolutely. Do we have it all figured out? No. We have a lot figured out. We have clear steps that we know we need to take, and we're stalling because of we're lacking the political will to take those steps. So, yeah, that's how I view that.
I recently had the opportunity to go to Antarctica, and I had mixed feelings about it. For the same reason I would, though I've never been heli skiing, I would be like, okay, I'm just burning up a bunch of carbon or releasing a bunch of carbon to do this. But I went, and part of my motivation was just seeing like what was happening down there. It's so remote. It's so wild. You hear about the ice sheet shrinking, all these things. You were there in 2009. Did you have the same internal conflict, and what were some of your impressions when you were there?
Yeah, I definitely, I mean, anytime I get on a plane, especially, as you know, that is the edge of the earth. I have huge internal conflicts. It's what's led to 90% of my snowboarding being done driving distance, where I live, there's, the Western US is a foot powered paradise. But as far as my experience in Antarctica, I thought it was the most beautiful place I've ever been. I've never seen that kind of contrast of ocean and dramatic peaks with all the sea life. Yeah, I've never seen anything like that anywhere on the planet.
I don't think it exists anywhere. You and I have had the good fortune of traveling a lot, and I really don't think there's anything that even comes close. And, since you've been there over the last 15 years, there's been a growing tourist economy kind of emerging there with a bunch of purpose-built ships, and these mega yachts are now starting to go down there. And I'm hearing, guide friends are guiding some of their clients down there. There's been this organization called IATO, and I forget the acronym, but it's essentially a bunch of tour operators decided they needed to self-regulate to protect, having these policies around getting on and off Zodiacs and doing all this stuff, which I'm guessing was probably not the case when you were there. I bet it was pretty Wild West at the time.
Yeah, I mean, it was kind of like point and go, for sure.
I was struck by how much wildlife there was. I kind of expected this cold, barren place, but man, it was teeming. It was insane.
Yeah, I just could not believe, I mean, it's like going and riding some of the best lines of my life and ended up gliding to the edge of the shore, and you're hanging out with penguins and walruses and looking out at killer whales. And I mean, most incredible place I've ever been to.
And you haven't been back since?
No, I haven't been back since. I have that same guilt. I'm grateful that I went there. If I was to do it again, it would be my big trip of the year, which it was when I went, but I would try to like ideally spend get dropped off on shore or but in general, I'm grateful I got to experience it, but it's hard for me to justify to kind of keep going back there.
Let's get back to your book for a little bit. And you've got kids that are a little older, but pretty young still. And I was wondering, about your family, right? We heard your story coming up to Stowe. Your parents fell in love with skiing. I gathered that your parents fell in love with skiing, probably like mine did. They're from a generation where skiing was more of a pastime than a lifestyle, or, in our case, a livelihood. But your kids, they have the benefit and maybe the challenge of being the children of someone whose whole life is really this, right? What are the challenges for kids that have had that just front and center in their lives, not just on weekends, but front and center in their life that you didn't have? What are the differences between yourself and your kids in that way? Have you ever thought about it like that?
One thing no kid ever wants to hear is you don't know how lucky you are or what have you. Every kid's got their own struggles. But I don't, for us, it's just snowboarding has been just such a part of our life. Their dad being a pro snowboarder, there's so few films my kids have seen of me snowboarding. So there's not a lot of talk of snowboarding at my house. Sure, they see someone get fired up and want to get a pic at the mountain or what have you, but in general, it's really downplayed. And it's like, yeah, my job is snowboarding. And we sell snowboards. I make these films, but that doesn't make me any better than, my neighbor's a doctor and, like our friend group, and I guess maybe in this town, there's pros and there's real estate agents and house painters and what have you. And we respect everyone and everyone is really treated equal in this town. And pro athletes are really not put on a pedestal in this town and certainly not at my house.
There's so many of them there.
Yeah. And you see, for example, like Danny Davis lived down the street from me for a long time. So here's one of the most famous snowboarders in the world. And yeah, he's just a regular dude. And so I guess just, how approachable these people are. And again, nobody's on a pedestal and
Well, that's interesting because, right, there's so much exposure for the kids in your community to these high level athletes that they just know them as people.
They know them as people. And they also, at the end of the day, you see the injuries, you see the deaths, you see the travel. Like if you really have a front row seat to a pro athlete, and I don't mean to, it's obviously it's this great life, but it is, paycheck to paycheck when it's based on how rad you got the year before and the injuries start piling up. And then we've seen so many go astray, where sure, the pro athlete lifestyle looks great at 25. There's a lot of people where the pro athlete life at 45 or 55 does not look good. So they've equally seen the legend that's, in the lift line and kind of hobbled and kind of beat up and both mentally and physical. So it's a lifestyle, but there's also these other people that are, I got a buddy that is a house painter and he's on snow 150 days a year and he's super fit and he's got an awesome family and just another example of like people are crushing it here. And the pro athlete lifestyle is one path, but it's not the only path. And quite frankly, there's some other paths that look a lot nicer long term.
It's been interesting as I've gone through my career watching those like yourself. I mean, it's about a life. It's about navigating life and finding that fluid path. The pro athlete thing is short, almost no matter how you slice it. You got to come up with something else or you're going to, the odds are you're going to fall off a figurative cliff, when you hit a certain age or a certain injury. So you got to be prepared. You got to think ahead. We have to think about life that way. Every human, your painter buddy included, but boy, you're on the edge when you're a pro. It can be gone in a second.
Well, you're on the edge, and I always have looked at it as you're only as good as your last year. Every time I'd sign a contract, I'd say this could be the last one. And so it's just, accepting those realities.
Well, Jeremy Jones, thank you so much for joining me. I hope you continue to enjoy The Darkest White. Really looking forward to that coming out. I'm going to have Eric Blem on the podcast here probably in December. So hope you can listen to that. But thanks again for joining me today.
Thank you. Appreciate the opportunity. Love what you guys are doing. And I'm just happy to be a part of it.
Thank you for listening and subscribing to the Backcountry Podcast and for supporting independent media. The Backcountry Podcast is produced by Backcountry Magazine, an imprint of Height of Land Publications in Jeffersonville, Vermont. Backcountry's small but mighty staff works hard to bring you stories that are beautifully produced, thoughtfully edited, and thoroughly fact-checked. Betsy Monero is our editor-in-chief. Mike Horn is our podcast producer and engineer. Our music was composed by Alex Paul. Please consider supporting independent journalism by subscribing at backcountrymagazine.com. Use code PODCAST for 10% off your entire order. I'm Adam Howard. Thanks for listening. Until next time, we'll see you in the backcountry.